Vice President Al Gore.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's so great to be back in South Florida. You know, I came here to Miami on a book tour when I wrote Earth in the Balance back in late 1991 and before joining Bill Clinton 6-8 months after that. It seems like a long time that I have been speaking and writing about this issue of the climate crisis. So all these years later, here we are, just 1 month away from the historic meeting in Copenhagen, Denmark, where all of the nations of the world are about to gather to try to get a treaty that accelerates the movement to solve the climate crisis and bring about reductions in the global warming pollution. Today, all around the world, we will put 90 million tons of global warming pollution into that thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet. And all of that global warming pollution is trapping a lot more heat in the Earth's atmosphere. 25 million of those tons go into the ocean every single day, and they're making the ocean more acidic, interrupting the forming of coral reefs, and everything that makes a shell has a kind of an osteoporosis now. And in the atmosphere, the CO2, which is the principal global warming pollution, along with methane and black carbon and the other pollutants, nitrous oxide and volatile organics and carbon monoxide, all of that together traps the heat and raises temperatures. The planet has a fever, in effect. Now, if you have a young child and the child starts running a fever, you may think it's a 24-hour bug. Usually it is, often it is. But if it keeps on going up, well, you go to the doctor. And if the doctor says, we've done the tests here, and the bad news is it's not a passing bug, we're going to have to take some action here, but good news is if we take action, we can fix this. You don't say, well, doctor, I was listening to talk radio, and I just think you're full of hot air. You may want to get a second opinion, and we've done that. 20 years ago, the United Nations set up a body of the 3,000 finest scientists in the world, specializing in the many disciplines that have to be brought to bear in an effort to understand this unprecedented crisis. And now, over the last 40 years, they have issued 4 unanimous reports. And the last one declared that the evidence is unequivocal. Unequivocal. And they're practically shouting from the rooftops saying we have got to take action because the temperatures continue to rise and the buildup of this global warming pollution threatens in the future truly catastrophic damage that threatens the future of human civilization itself. And it's been difficult for all of us to really get our arms around how big this crisis is. Partly because as human beings we naturally sometimes confuse the unprecedented with the improbable. If something's never happened before, we're generally safe in assuming it's not going to happen in the future. But the exceptions can kill you. And this is one of the exceptions. And it's unprecedented because what's happened in the last 100 years or so is there's been a radical change in the relationship between humanity and the ecological system of the planet. We've quadrupled population in just 100 years. In 1900, the population was a little over 1.5 billion. Now it's 6.8 billion. And that's a fundamentally new relationship between our species and the surprisingly fragile ecosphere of the planet. More importantly than that, the technologies in common use today are 1,000,000 times more powerful than the ones that our grandparents had at their disposal. Whether it's genetic engineering or new chemical processing or all of the powerful machinery that we use that churns through the carbon fuels in the crust of the earth and leaves that residue in the atmosphere. The combination of 6.8 billion people, soon in this century, halfway through this century, going above 9 billion people, multiplied by these powerful technologies, just give us a much, much bigger impact than we ever had before. And when the scientists are virtually unanimous in saying, hey, this is unequivocal, we've got to act, it's a real challenge to our moral imagination, first of all, and then to our ability to get our act together and make the changes that are necessary to do something about it. And most of the changes, and they're outlined in this book, are changes that we should be making for other reasons anyway. In addition to the climate crisis, remember, we've got an economic crisis, and we need to create millions of good new jobs. Well, this is a good way to do that. We've also got a national security crisis that's linked to our overdependence on foreign oil, which is a dependence that keeps rising year by year by year. One of the charts in this book, and by the way, it's filled with full-color pictures and graphics, and it's like an inconvenient truth in that it's easy to read and it pulls you into it. But one of the two-page graphics shows what's happened to the price of oil over the last 35 years, connected to the political events that affect the price of oil. And it's not an accident that the first Arab OPEC oil embargo came just 2 years after the peak production of oil in the United States back in 1971. And now we may be, according to many, may already be, as some people think, we've passed peak oil production globally. That's an argument between the geologists and the economists, and we don't know the answer, but the International Energy Agency just published its first comprehensive report of oil supplies in the world, and of course the biggest oil supplies are in the Middle East. We get our oil more from Canada and Venezuela and Nigeria, but also Saudi Arabia. But the world oil market is affected by what happens in those very large pools of oil in the Persian Gulf. And they sometimes, indeed often, manipulate the price to reach two objectives. First, naturally, they seek to maximize their revenue. They want to get as much money as they can, and we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars to foreign countries every year just for the millions of barrels of oil that we use every single day. But they have a second objective, and we haven't really taken into account in our thinking their second objective. They seek to manage our political will in the United States. The price goes way up, and we begin to feel a sense of shock, and we get our act together a little bit and say, okay, we're going to get off this foreign oil. We're going to do something about it. But then when they see us getting close to shifting away from foreign oil, then the price comes back down again. You know how that happens. And then we relax and we wait for the next cycle. So we've been on this roller coaster, and we've had 2 wars over in the Persian Gulf in the last couple of decades, and those wars have many complicated causes, but one of them is our national security is threatened if we have a sudden cutoff of the oil supplies at a time when we're so ridiculously dependent on foreign oil. So there's a common thread running through the climate crisis, the economic crisis, and the security crisis. And that common thread that links them all is our absurd overdependence on carbon-based fuels. And if we grab hold of that thread and pull it hard, all three of these crises begin to unravel, and we hold in our hand the answer to all three of them. And that is to switch from carbon-based fuels to abundant, renewable energy sources available right here in the United States of America. Much higher levels of efficiency, sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry. We know what to do, but this book, Our Choice, A Plan to Solve the Climate Crisis, outlines the solutions to the climate crisis. And they offer us the opportunity to create millions of good new jobs right here in the United States, jobs that cannot be outsourced to foreign countries because they're inherently American jobs. They offer us the chance to cut that dependence, and most importantly, they give us the means to discharge the moral responsibility that we have to our children and future generations, and also to ourselves, because these impacts of the climate crisis are beginning to unfold right now. We see it in the deeper and longer droughts because higher average temperatures evaporate more moisture out of the soil. The climate change, the change in the patterns shifts the places where the rain falls, and when it comes, it leads to much larger downpours, but then that's moisture evaporation out of the soil gives us larger floods and larger droughts, and the scientists are agreed on that. We see more fires. There's been an enormous increase in the size and the number of large fires on every single continent, because when the vegetation dries out, then you get more kindling. And you also get more lightning, by the way. A study at the University of Tel Aviv demonstrates that each 1 degree increase in temperature brings a 10% increase in lightning strikes. You put more energy in a system, it becomes more energetic. You also get stronger storms coming off the warmer oceans. And of course, South Florida has had a bitter experience with these stronger storms. And the storms have faster winds and higher moisture content in the storm. So they're more destructive for both of those reasons. You also get a melting of the ice in all of the ice-covered regions of the world. And in those places that depend on the seasonal melting of the snow and ice in the mountains for the drinking water and agricultural water, places like California, in South America, in Europe, and most significantly in terms of the number of people affected in the Himalayas, you know, 40% of all the people who live on this planet now get 50% of their drinking water and agricultural water from the seasonal melting of the snows and the ice in the Himalayas. And the 7 great rivers of Asia, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Salween, Irrawaddy, the Mekong, the Yangtze River and Yellow River in China. They all originate in the same field of ice in the Himalayas. And that ice is melting, that snow is melting. In some of those areas, the flows increase temporarily, but when it's gone, then the flows are shut off. And as the ice melts in the large chunks of ice, masses of ice in Greenland and West Antarctica, which is the most vulnerable part of Antarctica, each one of those areas of ice is equivalent to an increase in sea level of 6 to 7 meters or 20 feet or so. We've already seen the beginnings of sea level rise, slowly at first, but it's now accelerating. And if those large masses of ice become destabilized, and there's evidence that that process may be beginning now, then we could see catastrophic sea level rise. And each 1 meter of sea level rise generates approximately 100 million climate refugees. In places like Bangladesh, that process has already begun. People who used to rebuild their lives every 20 years when the storm surges came are now having to rebuild their lives every 4 or 5 years. And they can't do that, so they're moving to the cities. And concertina barbed wire's gone up on the border between Bangladesh and India. In the low-lying island nations like the Maldives, the trickle of refugees has already begun. The Maldives just added a new line item to their budget last year entitled Fund to Purchase a New Country. And it's not a joke to them, I'm telling you. You may have seen a few weeks ago, they had a cabinet meeting in scuba gear underwater. And maybe, you think maybe that's a publicity stunt. Well, they're trying desperately to get the attention of the rest of the world to what's happening to them. And we are all in this together. The increase of global warming pollution anywhere on Earth threatens the future of civilization everywhere on Earth. Now, the North Polar ice cap, just to spend one more minute on these impacts, the North Polar ice cap is a floating ice cap covering the Arctic Ocean. For most of the last 3 million years, it's been the size of the continental United States. 40% of it has disappeared in the last 2 or 3 decades. And some of the scientists are now saying we're in danger of losing all of it during the summer months within the next 5, 10, 15 years. Now, the reason that's important is that doesn't raise sea level because it's floating. But when it disappears, then it doesn't reflect the sun's radiation. The open Arctic Ocean absorbs it and heats up much more rapidly than the rest of the world. And the shores of the Arctic Ocean, extending far inland, are frozen now, the permafrost, the tundra. And it contains such large quantities of frozen carbon, mostly frozen plant matter down in the soil, that it's beginning to thaw out and release methane and CO2. And were that process not to be interrupted, then we would double the amount of this global warming pollution in the atmosphere in a relatively short period of time, making an already difficult problem twice as hard to deal with. So the time to act is now. And the scientists often warn us that we don't have the luxury of time just to wait and wait and wait. But we have got to reach a consensus in order to solve this problem in time and to solve it effectively. And one of the ways to build that consensus is to reach agreement on the fact that the solutions are available. And over the last 3.5 years since the publication of An Inconvenient Truth, I have really dug deeply into this, holding more than 30 so-called solution summits with the leading experts from all around the world coming together to talk and study and discuss with one another exactly what the latest findings are, what the latest breakthroughs are, and what the best thinking is on how we can solve this crisis. And in a real sense, this book is based on the insights of these global experts, and I'm grateful to them. Their names are all listed in the back in the acknowledgments. There are quite a few of them. And the one learning experience for me out of this process that's been most exciting is that it's now obvious to me that we've got more than enough solutions to solve 3 or 4 climate crises. And the good news is we only have to solve one. But in order to do it, we've got to start acting now, and that means overcoming the resistance of some of the very powerful lobbies that understand that the old ways, the old polluting ways, make them a lot of money, and they don't want to change, and they've got a lot of political power, and they've got a lot of influence, and they're spending a lot of money, and they're working very hard to try to paralyze the political process and prevent the kinds of changes that are necessary to allow us to really solve this crisis. So this book is a presentation of a complete plan to actually solve the climate crisis. It has an introduction and a conclusion and a few parts with many chapters in between. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes here giving you an overview of this book, and then I look forward to signing books for you, and I hope you enjoy this book. I start with a presentation of exactly why this crisis has unfolded, and that's just for the starters. And there's 6 pollutants, 6 kinds of pollutants that are put up there, and each of the 6 is connected to a whole pattern of activity. And I trace that at the very beginning. Then in the second chapter, I focus in on energy, where it comes from and where it goes, and how we use it, and what patterns are connected to those energy systems. And that's important because oil and coal are the principal sources of energy in the global economy, and they represent together the single largest source of global warming pollution. You know, 150 years ago this year, 2 events took place at the same time that are connected to this. The first oil well in the world was drilled in Pennsylvania by Colonel Edwin Drake. He wasn't really a colonel, but that's another story. At the same time, the great Irish scientist John Tyndall discovered that CO2 traps heat, traps infrared radiation. And so the birth of modern climate science and the birth of the oil age both date back to the same moment 150 years ago. We had already begun to use coal at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and then that began to accelerate. But oil overtook coal, and now the 2 of them together, both rich in carbon, represent the principal source of fuel for our economy. And shifting away from these dirty, polluting fuels is really one of the principal challenges that we face in solving the climate crisis. It's not the only one, and I go into the others in this book as well. But then in section 2 of the book, I focus in on the principal sources of energy that we can get from renewable sources. First of all, solar energy. There is enough sunlight that falls on the surface of our planet in 1 hour to equal a full year's supply of energy for the entire world. And the scientists and engineers have gotten better and better at capturing and converting that sunlight into electricity. There are 2 principal ways they do that. If you don't count the hot water heaters, which are very, very effective, and we ought to make greater use of that. If you don't count passive solar energy, which is also a very effective use of solar energy. But if you're talking about producing electricity, there are 2 principal ways to do that. The sun's rays can be concentrated with mirrors to boil water and make steam and turn the turbine generators. And that's being done already. And it's a very effective way to make virtually unlimited amounts of electricity. The second way is probably advancing a little more rapidly than the first way, and that's what's called photovoltaic energy, a big $20 word that just means that they've figured out how to take the photons in the sunlight and transform them into electrons that make electrical current. And that's an exciting source because innovation gives us a lot of leverage on improving the cost effectiveness of that source of energy. And they're coming up with a lot of exciting breakthroughs. And most of them are made out of silicon, and that reminds us that silicon was used to make computer chips. And you know what's happened with computer chips and computers. They get twice as powerful for the same money every 18 to 24 months. It's called Moore's Law, named after the man that first noticed this pattern back in 1947, and it's continued for more than 60 years now. And the transistors that can be fit on a chip double every 18 to 24 months, and that's what drives that process of innovation that brings the cost down. Well, and by the way, that Moore's law is not a law of physics. It's a law of self-fulfilling expectations. These computer chip companies realized that the demand for computer chips was growing so rapidly, it made sense for them to invest a lot of money in research and development so that they could capture a larger share of that growing market. And each one of them, Intel and AMD and the others, they look over their shoulders at the competition and they know they've got to innovate and spend more on research and development so they can continue to keep that price coming down. And now there are, this sounds unbelievable, but it's true. You think of how many transistors there are in this room and in some of the watches and cameras, certainly lots and lots of them in computers and these lights, almost everything. For every man, woman, and child on this planet, there are now 1 billion transistors. It's unbelievable. But the point of that story is that cost reduction curve came from the realization that this incredible revolution was unfolding, and so they invested in the innovation that brought the cost down and improved the effectiveness. That same process is now beginning to happen with photovoltaic energy. But we can affect it by making a choice. Our choice consistently comes back to the point that by making the choice to shift away from carbon-based fuels, we can have a huge impact on the R&D, on the development process, and therefore on the cost reductions for these exciting new forms of energy. The pattern so far is this: every doubling of the market for photovoltaic energy has reduced the cost by 20%. That's not as powerful as Moore's law. But when the world makes a commitment to move swiftly in this direction, we will see sharp cost reductions. So solar energy is an incredibly exciting form of energy. And of course, in South Florida, you've got one of the greatest resources of sunlight of anywhere in the world. And secondly, wind energy. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because you all know that it's a very effective and in many places in the world very competitive now as a source of energy. But here's something you may not know. Here in the United States, for each of the last 2 years, the largest new source of electricity in both of those years has been wind, more than coal, oil, nuclear, gas put together. And we're not even using the best wind resources we have in the mountain corridor because the transmission lines don't run to the remote areas where the wind blows the strongest. And they don't run to the southwestern desert areas where the solar energy is cheapest and most effective. So later in the book, there's a chapter on what's called the supergrid. And you've heard of smart grids that are designed to replace the antiquated, obsolete electrical grid we have in the United States today. We need to replace it anyway. And there are 2 new technological breakthroughs that make this new supergrid very compelling. First of all, they have new transmission lines that don't waste and lose so much of the electricity. And you can now transmit electricity over long distances of thousands of miles if you want to, with very few losses. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, because of the computer chips and the information revolution, we can now put these smart devices and transistors throughout the grid that help to balance it and eliminate the waste and help to balance the peak loads and make the whole thing much more efficient and make it less vulnerable to breakdowns and outages and cascading failures. Presently, our country loses more than $200 billion per year from these outages and failures in our electricity grid. You may have noticed in the news a couple of days ago that most of Brazil and part of Uruguay just lost all their electricity because of failures in their transmission grid. Well, we have those too. The New York blackout was probably the most recent famous example of it, but there's smaller ones that happen all the time. And since so many businesses now depend on computers and sophisticated electrical equipment, it costs a huge amount of money when all of a sudden it fails. So there are multiple reasons why we need to build a super grid. And that process has begun. President Obama, after only 1 month in office, put that stimulus in place and helped to fight back the recession. And as we continue to build this super grid, we're going to create millions of good new jobs, also by building the solar panels and the windmills and making this historic transition away from the dirty, polluting, vulnerable carbon-based fuels. The third new source of energy I talk about in the third chapter, I guess chapter 5, but the third one in this section, is something called enhanced geothermal energy. And this is a sleeper in this debate, because there's widespread misunderstanding about geothermal energy. Most people still think of geothermal energy in connection with the places where hot water bubbles up from inside the earth, and some of those places have long been used to produce electricity. But now, with the new technology for drilling deeper into the earth, with drill bits that don't melt when you get farther down, because the farther down you go, the hotter the temperature gets. And if you go down 2 kilometers in almost the entire western United States, and if you go a little deeper in the entire United States, there is a virtually unlimited source of extreme heat that can be used to generate electricity. They now estimate that we in the United States have a 35,000-year supply of energy just from this enhanced geothermal energy. And it's not intermittent like solar and wind. It doesn't depend on when the sun shines and when the wind blows. It's constant, 24 hours a day. So that is a very exciting source of renewable energy that this book details and shows how we can use it and how we can create jobs in the process. Then the fourth source is a controversial one called biomass, and that basically means organic plant matter being used for either liquid fuels or the production of electricity. And we need to tread carefully on this one, because we made a commitment some years ago to making ethanol out of corn, and that first generation of ethanol really turned out to be something of a disappointment. If you go about it carefully, it can work, and it can be positive in terms of energy and cost. But in practice, what's happened is the agricultural inputs rely so heavily on petroleum and natural gas that it turns out in many cases to have a negative energy balance. And it has provided an extra source of income for farmers, but they're now disappointed with the program as well. But we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as they say, because there is a second generation of ethanol and a third generation, and these new forms of biomass fuel are far more cost-effective, much higher yields, and they don't compete with food crops, and they don't use plants that have to be grown on land that would otherwise be used for food. So this is an exciting source. And in the rest of the world, there's been a shift away from making liquid fuels out of biomass, and a shift toward using that to create electricity instead of burning coal and oil. And on our transportation system, which is one of the big reasons why we need liquid fuels, there is an answer that you have seen beginning to emerge, and it's very exciting. The old systems for powering cars, the internal combustion engine, more than 100 years old, is horribly inefficient and polluting. And now you're beginning to see the first appearance of electric cars, plug-in electrics, electric hybrids, and soon all electric vehicles. So the combination of a shift to electric cars and this supergrid and renewable sources of electricity give us the exciting prospect of becoming far less dependent on foreign oil for the source of gasoline, and it's also one of the new solutions that's going to create millions of new jobs in the process. Now, biomass is connected to living systems, and the next section of the book, well, wait a minute, hold on, let me back off, because before I go to that, I want to mention two chapters that deal with controversial sources of solutions. One is nuclear power, and the second is carbon capture and sequestration. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I encourage you to read more about it if you're interested in it. First of all, nuclear power. I used to represent Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the nuclear industry began. And I used to be very enthusiastic about nuclear power. But I've grown more skeptical and cautious over the years because of the practical experience that we've had with nuclear power. I'm not opposed to nuclear power, and I think there will be some more nuclear reactors. But we've got to be realistic about this technology and not just think it's a silver bullet. Let's assume for the moment that we will solve the problems of nuclear waste disposal, that we will solve the problems of safety in the operation of these reactors. I've watched so many episodes of The Simpsons, I know that Homer operates one of these plants. But let's assume that we'll solve these problems, and I think that we will. But that still leaves two big problems. First of all, the cost has been increasing at the rate of 15% per year. And a plant that used to cost $400 million now costs $4 billion, and it's still increasing at the rate of 15% a year. And they only come in one size, extra large. And so the utilities have been real reluctant to commit so much money to these very large, very expensive plants when there's not a single engineering firm in the United States or Europe that I can find that will stand behind an estimate of how much it'll cost to build one or how long it'll take to build one. So the present generation of nuclear reactors has been disappointing and has grossly unacceptable economics. Now, with ever larger subsidies from taxpayers, there will be some built, and they will play a role. And I hope that the new designs that are now being developed for smaller reactors that are inherently safer will enable that technology to play a larger role, but we're talking 20, 25 years out before those designs are really available, and we've got to act now. So the other one, carbon capture and sequestration, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, that would be great if we could do it economically and quickly. We could keep on burning fossil fuels and just capture all the CO2 and bury it safely in the ground. And it sounds intriguing, and I think this too will play a role in our effort to solve this crisis, but probably not as anywhere near as large a role as the enthusiastic advocates of that technology hope, because here are the problems. If you run a coal-fired generating plant, you're in the business of selling electricity. If you install a carbon capture and sequestration operation at that plant, you've got to take more than 1/3 of the electricity you're generating just to run the carbon capture and sequestration operation. So your business plan is just taking a big hit. If you've got to get rid of 1/3 of your main product just to make it safe. And now, again, the taxpayers are being asked to subsidize this, and probably there's some fair balance that makes it usable in some locations. And with enough research and development, maybe they will find a cheaper and more effective way to capture the CO2. But the sheer volume of the CO2 is so enormous. Every single day, it would equal far more than all of the oil we're importing every day, more than all of the natural gas and all the pipelines. And then in order to store it safely. They've got to do a lot of very time-consuming work to understand and characterize the underground geology in the places where they believe it's safe to store it, and that takes a lot of time and money. And again, they'll be able to do it, and the good news is that it's probably safe. All of the elements of that technology have been shown to work. They've just never been integrated and demonstrated at a large commercial scale, and that too will take time. And each one of the sites is very, very different, and they have to make sure there's not some abandoned well running down through it that could serve as a chimney for it to come back out, and they can do that. But again, there's a burden of implausibility there that should cause us to be realistic about the cost and how much time it'll take for that to play a role. And by that time, we could have made this shift over to renewable energy. But let me move to the next part of the book that deals with the living systems, principally forests and soils, and I want to talk just briefly about population as well. Sometimes I hear people say, well, we need to come up with some device that will scavenge CO2 out of the air. Wouldn't that be great, and sequester it? Well, we have such a device. It's called a tree. And if you take that technology to scale, it's called a forest. Now, we need to plant a lot more trees, but here's the problem we're facing today. All around the world, principally in places like Brazil and Indonesia and some of the tropical nations, we are burning and destroying the forests of the earth, and it's driven by poverty and population and subsistence agriculture and the greed of some of the folks that don't care and they just want to strip mine all the trees. But approximately 20% of all the global warming pollution that goes into the atmosphere every day comes from the burning and destruction of forests. So this agreement they're trying to get at Copenhagen blends together reductions in industrial emissions and a reversal of the deforestation around the world. And that is a very important part of the solution. And just today, or just yesterday, Brazil had a very positive announcement that they have made great progress in reducing their deforestation. And President Lula there has been one of the leaders in the emerging economies to try to come up with good solutions there. So there's positive news on that front, but we need to do a lot more. Now, the next chapter is about soils, and you may wonder what that has to do with it. Well, there's between 3 and 4.5 times as much carbon in the topsoil of the world as there is in all the trees and all the vegetation put together. And when I was growing up, I spent all my summers on our family's farm in Tennessee, and I learned from my dad what good, rich soil looks like. Anybody grow up on a farm? What does it look like? It's black. Black and moist. Why is it black? It's the carbon. 58% of the layer in which the plants grow is carbon. And industrial agriculture has led to the release of all that carbon. And when the carbon's pulled out of the soil, the nitrogen is pulled out also. The soils become less fertile and less productive. That's why our grandparents used to know about crop rotation, to give the soil a little rest and plant trees and crops that would put the nutrients and the carbon and the nitrogen back into the soil. But the industrial agriculture techniques have relied on synthetic ammonia fertilizers like steroids for growing plants, and that has really hurt the fertility of the soil and has released enormous amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. So part of the solution to this crisis involves agriculture. We've got to take a hard look at industrial agriculture and factory farming and the reliance on corn. There are better ways, and they can be more profitable for farmers. The no-till, organic, better approaches to farming based on a better understanding of how the soil is revitalized. And in areas of the world like sub-Saharan Africa, where they have an impending food crisis, famines growing. It's partly connected to the fact that they've strip mined their soils. And so, as with a lot of the solutions to this climate crisis, we can solve several problems simultaneously. We can fight food insecurity, provide new income for subsistence farmers, and put a lot more of the carbon back into the soil. Now, just a brief word on population. The stunning increase in population that I referred to at the beginning of my talk is one of the principal reasons we have a bigger impact on the earth today. But it's important for us to recognize that this is a success story unfolding in slow motion. We are seeing a slowing of the population increases around the world, and they're confident now that it's very likely that halfway through this century, the global population will stabilize, because they now understand the pattern. There are two patterns, and we shift from one to the other. High birth rates, large families, high death rates, and that shifts toward low birth rates, small families, and low death rates. And we've been through that transition. How many people here, I'd like to see a show of hands, how many people here have grandparents who had 5 or 6 siblings in their family? All right. Now, how many of you have 5 or 6 children? Okay. Okay. Congratulations. But that's called the demographic transition, and we see it right here in this room. Our country, Western Europe, Japan, we've already been through it. Good news is that everywhere in the world, that pattern, that shift is well underway. And they know what produces that shift now. They used to think it was industrialization, but that's just an indirect factor. Actually, there are 4 factors that bring about that change. Number 1, the education of girls. Number 2, men, did you notice a slightly higher pitch to that reaction? You'll like this other one. The second one, too, is the empowerment of women to take part in the decisions of society. Number 3, the availability of fertility management to give families the ability to choose how many children and the spacing of children. And in ways that are culturally acceptable, country by country. Number 4, most importantly, turns out, higher child survival rates. And that may sound counterintuitive, but actually the confidence on the part of parents that their children will survive is the key factor in unleashing the natural preference for smaller families. And where all 4 of those conditions are present, this historic shift is taking place all over the world. Okay, now, the final section of the book before the conclusion deals with the obstacles that have to be removed in order to implement these solutions. We've got the solutions. We've got more than we need. But in order to implement them, we've got to move the obstacles in our path. And I focus in on 3 of them in particular. And we're running out of time, so I'm not going to go into detail, but we've got political obstacles that we have to remove, okay? These large carbon polluters have been spending about $1 billion a year around the world in order to try to paralyze the political systems and prevent the changes they think will be a disadvantage to them. And they're not our enemy. They need to be a part of the solution. But we're long past the time where we can just sit back and relax and let them make all the decisions on behalf of the rest of us, because they're the ones paying attention. And so part of the message of this book is you are part of the solution. In fact, you are the key solution to the climate crisis. You need to become active as citizens. It's important to change the light bulbs and the windows, but it's a whole lot more important to change the laws and the policies and to get a treaty that enables us to solve this crisis. And our political system is not working as well as it should. Maybe you've noticed that. Every time there is some kind of reform in the public interest, the special interests that don't want to see reform have way more power than they should. And I go into some of the reasons for that and some of the reasons for the lethargy in our democracy. You know, the average American now watches television 5 hours a day. 5 hours a day. You do the, and here we are at the book fair. That means that somebody is making up for us and bringing that average up. We have got to reinvigorate our democratic process. And the internet-based forms of communication are once again enabling individuals to take part in the conversation of democracy and use the power of ideas and become advocates. And again, you are the key solution to this, so please contact your members of Congress. Right now, contact your senators, because that's where the legislation is right now. It's already passed the House of Representatives, and so I hope that all in the sound of my voice will take that to heart and be a part of the solution. Second obstacle that I deal with here is the flaws in the way we measure pollution in our economic system. Because CO2 is invisible, tasteless, and odorless, but more importantly, it has no price tag. And so the market sends signals to polluters every day, and the signals say it's perfectly all right to dump 90 million tons into the atmosphere every day as if it's an open sewer. We don't care. We're not paying attention. And every time in our history, we as Americans have tried to improve the quality of life by controlling pollution. Every time we've said, don't dump it in the water, don't poison the air. Always the polluters have said, oh, don't do that to us, that's going to be terrible. And then when we've persisted and controlled pollution, turns out to be a lot cheaper to control it. You can do it a lot faster, and it makes life a lot better. And we look back and say, why did we put up with that for so long? This is the biggest example of it, and we've got to speak up as Americans and insist that the market system have a signal that helps us control this pollution by having a price on it. Now, the final obstacle I deal with is one of the most interesting, and I invite you to read about it. It's an analysis of the way we think about the climate crisis. And I had 2 full days with neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists. There's an explosion of interesting, fascinating new research on this. I had to put them in different days. I didn't know that neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists have to be kept apart, but I'm mostly joking on that, but not entirely. Just briefly, you know, we are predisposed to short-term thinking. And one of the reasons for that is that our ancestors survived certain kinds of threats that emphasize short-term thinking. And I don't want to go into the evolutionary process. I know that's controversial. We had a trial in my home state, you know. And I thought about that when the Chamber of Commerce said they wanted a new Scopes trial on climate. I can tell you, coming from Tennessee, one Scopes trial is enough. But however you believe we developed, the threats that our ancestors faced are different from the ones we faced. When you leave here today, I'd guess that the odds of you running into a leopard or a lion are probably pretty small. But our thinking is still shaped by what we've inherited from our ancestors. The good news is we do have the capacity to form long-term goals based on deeply shared values and then stay the course to go to those long-term goals. The greatest generation after World War II got tired of all these world wars coming out of Europe, and so they made a decision to set a long-term goal with the Marshall Plan. And Democrats and Republicans worked together for decades, and now Europe is unifying with peace and prosperity, and we haven't had another world war come out of Europe. That's part of the benefit of having this long-term thinking. We have that capacity, and now we've got to use that capacity. Now, then in the conclusion of the book, I sketch out 2 scenarios, whether we make it or whether we don't. And I think we are going to make it. I'm optimistic, because if we were to just take the benefits of all the hard work and sacrifices of previous generations and exploit them fully in our lifetimes to the point where nothing was left, and then give the back of our hand to future generations, that would be the single most immoral act by any generation of human beings that's ever been alive on this planet. And one of the sources of the passion I feel for this issue is that I don't think that's who we are. I don't for 1 minute think that's who we are. You know, there are some young people here, and many families represented here who have children in high school or college. If you're a member of a family like that, or if you're a young person, how many families have a daughter or a son who has changed his or her course of study or field of concentration in the last few years in order to learn about and gain the skills necessary to be a part of the solution to this crisis? Could I see a show of hands? Thank you very much. That is a source of hope. I remember when I was 13 years old, hearing President John F. Kennedy announce a goal of putting a man on the moon and bringing him back safely in 10 years. And I remember how many people said that's impossible, he shouldn't have done that. But 8 years and 2 months later, Neil Armstrong set foot on the surface of the moon and planted the American flag. And on that day in Houston at Mission Control, there was a great cheer that went up. And the average age of those systems engineers was 26, which means that when they heard that challenge, their average age was 18. All over the world, this new generation is rising to be a part of this solution, and we're counting on them. But ladies and gentlemen, they're counting on us. We have got to rise to this challenge. And there's an old African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We have to go far quickly. Which means we've got to get our act together quickly. And we must, because not too many years from now, that next generation will look back on these first years of the 21st century. And they will ask one of two questions. If they see the earth undergoing this process of destruction, if they're the generation that is confronted with a reality that their prospects are far diminished and each successive generation will see a further deterioration and that civilization itself is threatened, they would be justified in looking back at us and asking, what were you thinking? Did you just choose to ignore the global scientific community? Didn't you notice the North Polar ice cap melting completely? What were you watching Dancing with the Stars? What in the world was going on? Didn't you care? But if they look around them and see a world in renewal, with millions of good new jobs, with the earth recovering, with solutions being applied to all of these related problems, with a sense of common purpose in life, with the prospect of increasing quality of life and prospects for each succeeding generation, then I want them to look back at us and ask, how did you find the moral courage to shake off that lethargy, listen and pay attention, and then feel the passion that comes from caring about those who come after us? That's the question I want them to ask, and we have to answer with our deeds, not only with our words. We have everything we need to solve this crisis, with the possible exception of political will. But ladies and gentlemen, as you know, here in the United States of America, political will is a renewable resource. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. Thank you. fragile ecosphere of the planet. More importantly than that, the technologies in common use today are 1,000,000 times more powerful than the ones that our grandparents had at their disposal. Whether it's genetic engineering or new chemical processing or all of the powerful machinery that we use that churns through the carbon fuels in the crust of the earth and leaves that residue in the atmosphere. The combination of 6.8 billion people, soon in this century, halfway through this century, going above 9 billion people, multiplied by these powerful technologies, just give us a much, much bigger impact than we ever had before. And when the scientists are virtually unanimous in saying, hey, this is unequivocal, we've got to act, it's a real challenge to our moral imagination, first of all, and then to our ability to get our act together and make the changes that are necessary to do something about it. And most of the changes, and they're outlined in this book, are changes that we should be making for other reasons anyway. In addition to the climate crisis, remember, we've got an economic crisis, and we need to create millions of good new jobs. Well, this is a good way to do that. We've also got a national security crisis that's linked to our overdependence on foreign oil, which is interrupting the forming of coral reefs, and everything that makes a shell has a kind of an osteoporosis now. And in the atmosphere, the CO2, which is the principal global warming pollution, along with methane and black carbon and the other pollutants, nitrous oxide and volatile organics and carbon monoxide, all of that together traps the heat and raises temperatures. The planet has a fever, in effect. Now, if you have a young child and the child starts running a fever, you may think it's a 24-hour bug. Usually it is, often it is. But if it keeps on going up, well, you go to the doctor. And if the doctor says, we've done the tests here, and the bad news is it's not a passing bug, we're going to have to take some action here. But good news is if we take action, we can fix this. You don't say, well, doctor, I was listening to talk radio, and I just think you're full of hot air. You may want to get a second opinion, and we've done that. 20 years ago, the United Nations set up a body of the 3,000 finest scientists in the world, specializing in the many disciplines that have to be brought to bear in an effort to understand this unprecedented crisis. And now, over the last 40 years, they...
Vice President Al Gore.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's so great to be back in South Florida. You know, I came here to Miami on a book tour when I wrote Earth in the Balance back in late 1991 and before joining Bill Clinton 6-8 months after that. It seems like a long time that I have been speaking and writing about this issue of the climate crisis. So all these years later, here we are, just 1 month away from the historic meeting in Copenhagen, Denmark, where all of the nations of the world are about to gather to try to get a treaty that accelerates the movement to solve the climate crisis and bring about reductions in the global warming pollution. Today, all around the world, we will put 90 million tons of global warming pollution into that thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet. And all of that global warming pollution is trapping a lot more heat in the Earth's atmosphere. 25 million of those tons go into the ocean every single day. and they're making the ocean more acidic, a dependence that keeps rising year by year by year. One of the charts in this book, and by the way, it's filled with full-color pictures and graphics, and it's like an inconvenient truth in that it's easy to read and it pulls you into it. But one of the two-page graphics shows what's happened to the price of oil over the last 35 years, connected to the political events that affect the price of oil. And it's not an accident that the first Arab OPEC oil embargo came just 2 years after the peak production of oil in the United States back in 1971. And now we may be, according to many, may already be, as some people think, we've passed peak oil production globally. That's an argument between the geologists and the economists, and we don't know the answer, but the International Energy Agency just published its first comprehensive report of oil supplies in the world, and of course the biggest oil supplies are in the Middle East. We get our oil more from Canada and Venezuela and Nigeria, but also Saudi Arabia. But the world oil market is affected by what happens in those very large pools of oil in the Persian Gulf. And they sometimes, indeed often, manipulate the price to reach two objectives. First, naturally, they seek to maximize their revenue. They want to get as much. Have issued 4 unanimous reports. And the last one declared that the evidence is unequivocal. Unequivocal. And they're practically shouting from the rooftops saying we have got to take action because the temperatures continue to rise and the buildup of this global warming pollution threatens in the future truly catastrophic damage that threatens the future of human civilization itself. And it's been difficult for all of us to really get our arms around how big this crisis is. Partly because as human beings we naturally sometimes confuse the unprecedented with the improbable. If something's never happened before, we're generally safe in assuming it's not going to happen in the future. But the exceptions can kill you. And this is one of the exceptions. And it's unprecedented because what's happened in the last 100 years or so is there's been a radical change in the relationship between humanity and the ecological system of the planet. We've quadrupled population in just 100 years. In 1900, the population was a little over 1.5 billion. Now it's 6.8 billion. And that's a fundamentally new relationship between our species and the surprisingly